Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video we are going to be learning how to cut and sew this beautiful dress. I'll be continuing from my previous video where I showed how to cut a bustier top with a keyhole neckline. So if you haven't seen that video, you might want to start from there before watching this one. So also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do well to hit the subscribe button and also remember to like this video. And with that being said, let's get started. So right here I have half yards of Ankara fabric. This is actually a leftover fabric, and then I also have 2 yards of a plain crepe fabric. And then right here I have gone ahead to cut out the yoke part of this bustier, and then I've also cut the down part of the bustier using the plain fabric, and I added the sewing allowance as shown. So when you're done with this, you're going to open it up, and by the time you open it up, this is what it should look like. So the next thing to do now is we're going to be adding an interface into this fabric. This fabric is quite lightweight, so it's very important that you add an interface into it just to make it hard a little bit. Then when you're done adding it, the next thing to do is to pad the bustier. This step is completely optional. Personally, if I was sewing this without the video, I wouldn't have padded it. So in order to do this, we are going to be cutting the wording to be the exact shape as the center front. The only difference is that it is half an inch shorter at the neckline. So I'm going to be facing the shining part of the wording to the fabric, that is the wrong side of the fabric, and I'll take it to the pressing iron and I'll press it very well. While for the side front, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be placing the wording on fold like so, just enough to accommodate the side front, and then you place it on the wording, and then you cut all the way to the under bust area. So from that under bust area, you're going to stop cutting, and then you cut through the neckline as well. That is the top part of the bustier. Then when you're done cutting, you remove it from the wording, and then you cut all the way down to the under bust. So after cutting, you're going to place it on the fabric like so, and then we're going to just straighten up that under bust area, and then we're also going to reduce the wording by half an inch. The reason why we are reducing this by half an inch is because when we are sewing it with the lining, we don't want any bulkiness at the neckline area. So in order to avoid this, make sure you reduce it by half an inch at the top part. So when you're done, you're going to face the shining part to the wrong side of the fabric, and then you iron it. So when you're done ironing it, this is what it should look like. So now the next step is to join the Ankara to the dart line of this bustier. This step is completely optional. So in order to do this, we're going to be measuring from the neckline all the way down to the waistline. So whatever you get, it's going to tell you how long your fabric should be. So now the width of this fabric is 1.5 inches. So when you place it on fold, you will be having about 0.75 inches. So now you're going to take it to the sewing machine and you're going to sew it, aligning it to the dart lines. So when you're done with this is what it should look like. When you're done with this, I'm going to be joining the side front to the center front as the dart line using half an inch sewing allowance. So you join it on both sides, and by the time you're done, this is what it should look like. So now all we have to do is to notch the allowance from the underbust line, you notch it all the way up. This is just to open it up a bit so that the bustier will be relaxed at the bust area. So when you're done, you're going to you're going to open up the allowance like so, and then you press it very well so that it will be relaxed by the time you are done. So I've also gone ahead to cut out the lining piece for the bustier as well, and I've joined it together. Now for the yoke, I'm going to be removing the pattern from it. I've also cut the lining as well before removing, and then now I'm going to open it up. For the front, when you open it up, this is what it should look like because we cut on fold. So now I'm going to be aligning the lining with the fabric like so, and I'm going to be joining it at the neckline using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. When you're done, you're going to notch it. After that, I'm going to be placing my pattern back on the fabric, and I'm going to be marking out that area that we closed. So I'll mark it at that point, and then I'll also mark it at the other side as well. So with these 2 points now, I will be sewing from one point to the other using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. While the other part, I'm not going to be sewing it, I'm going to be leaving it as it is. So when you're done sewing, remember to notch from that point all the way to the other dart point. So when you're done notching it, you're going to open it up, turning it to the right side. So when you're done, when you turn it to the right side, this is what it should look like. At this point, you can go ahead and use a gum stay to iron it very well so that you will have a clean finish, or you can understitch it depending on what you want. So now I'm going to be joining the yoke to the bustier, and in order to do that, I'm going to be joining it at the dart point of the bustier. So just pay attention to where I started placing the yoke from. So now you're going to pin it all the way to the other side, and then I will do the same thing for the other side of it as well. And then I will take it to the sewing machine and I will sew using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. So by the time you're done sewing, this is what it should look like when you turn it to the right side. And then now we are going to be lining the bustier, and in order to do this, I will bring back the yoke and I'll join the lining parts to the main fabric, making sure that the neckline, the dart line, and the side seam are all aligned. Then I'll pin it down. So when you are pinning it down, make sure that the yoke is not interfering with that 1/2 inch point that we want to sew on. So when you take it to the sewing machine and you sew it, first and foremost, turn it to the right side and make sure that the yoke is in place, like you didn't sew on the yoke. Make sure that you did not sew. Make sure not to sew on the yoke. So when you are sure that the yoke is well placed and everything is as it's supposed to be, you're going to turn it to the wrong side and you are going to notch it all the way to the other end. The essence of this notching is just to make the neckline to be relaxed by the time we are done turning it with the lining. Then we can also go ahead to cut off excess if you don't want that as well. And then now the next thing we are going to do is to turn it to the right side, separating the lining from the fabric and the yoke, and then we are going to understitch it. And then after understitching it, you turn it to the right side and iron it. You can use a gum stay to iron it also. And when you are done with this, this is what you should have. So at this point, you can also join the lining to the fabric at the side seam. So for the back now, we have also gone ahead to cut the lining for the back yoke. So we are going to be joining it at the neckline using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. We're also going to join it all the way down as shown. So when you're done joining it, you're going to be notching it all the way to the neckline. So at this point, you can also cut off the excess at that point, and then you turn it to the right side. So when you turn it to the right side, you can take it to the pressing iron and iron it very well. And then for the down part of the back pattern, I've gone ahead to cut the lining as well. So now this is a pattern for the back. I'm just going to be joining the yoke back like so, and then I'll measure from the zipper line all the way to that neckline point. So what I got is 4 inches. So I'm going to be marking that 4 inches on the fabric like so. With this I will know the exact place that I'll be attaching the yoke to. So at this point, I've ironed out my yoke, and as you can see, I have a very clean finish. So I'm just going to be joining it at that 4 inches point that I marked earlier, and I'll pin it down and I'll sew it using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. After that, I'm going to be joining the lining to this as well using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. So when you're done sewing, you turn it to the right side, separating the lining from the fabric, and then you sew. So also, we are going to be joining it at the zipper line and at the side seam. And then when you turn it to the right side, this is what it should look like. So here we can go ahead to add a button as well as a hook at that neckline point just to secure it in place. I actually forgot to film that, but it's completely easy. Just attach a button and you can add a hook to it as well. So now we are going to be joining the back to the front at the side seam and also at the shoulder line. So to join it at the shoulder line, you join the back to the front, you pin it down, and then you sew. You can use 1/2 inch sewing allowance, so you can still use 0.75 sewing allowance just to hold it in place like that. And then while for the side seam, you're going to be dividing your bust measurement by 2. Then whatever you get, you mark it on the chest line area. So my bust measurement is 17. My bust measurement divided by 2 is 17. And what I have here is 19. So that means I'm marking 1 inches away from both sides to get that 17 inches. Then also half of my waist measurement, I'm going to be marking it also on the waistline area. And now I'll connect the chest line to the waistline like so. So I'll take it to the sewing machine and then I will sew it, and I'll also sew the shoulder line as well. So when you're done with this, the next step now is to focus. We are going to be focusing on the down part of this dress. So in order to draft that down part, we have gone ahead to mark out our waistline, which is the top line, and then I've marked out my hip line as well, and then you're going to mark out the length of the dress. Just depends on what you prefer. So after doing that, I'm going to be marking 1/4 of my waist measurement on the waistline, while on the hip line I'll mark 1/4 of my hip measurement. And then now I'm going to be connecting the waistline to the hip line. I'm using this rule as a guide to curve it a little bit all the way down. Then when you're done, the next thing to do now is from this new line that we marked out, I'm going to be going in by 4 inches. You can go up by 3 or less, just depends on what you want. And then while on the hip line, I'll go in by 4 inches. So I'm going to be using a French curve to connect these 2 points together like so. Then after that, on the length of the dress, I'm going to be marking 2.5 inches or 3 inches, just depends on how wide you want it to be. and then I'll connect it all the way to the hip line. So this is what we have now. This part is completely optional, just depends on the shape that you want to create. So right now I'll just connect it all the way to the end of the fabric, to the end of the paper, like so. So now when you're done, I'm just going to be cutting it off like so. So after cutting it off, you can go ahead and measure this line that I'm measuring now. This is just to know how long the Ankara that we'll be using at that point is going to be. So what I got is 22 inches. So I've gone ahead to cut I've placed the pattern on the fabric and I've cut. I added half an inch on that 22 inches point, while every other part I added 1 inch. And then for the back, I added a zipper allowance that is also 1 inches. So now we are going to be tracing out the hip line on the fabric, and make sure that you notch it. This is very important when you are joining the other part of the skirt to it. So just notch that hip line area, because that's where the gathers is going to be. So now I'm going to be separating the back from the front, and I'm going to be removing the fabric from it like so. So when you open it up for the front, this is what it should look like. Remember, we cut on fold for the front. So now I'm gonna ahead to cut a piece of fabric, Ankara fabric, that is more than the 22 inches that we marked earlier. So I'm going to be facing the part that is on fold towards the center front, like so, just the way we did for the bodice. I'm doing the same thing for the skirt as well. So I'm going to be doing the same thing for the other side of the center front. So just make sure you align the Ankara fabric to the plain fabric, and you sew using half an inch sewing allowance. So you're also going to do the same thing for the back as well. Remember, the back is not on fold, so we are going to be doing it for both sides. So when you're done with this is what it should look like. So I've also gone ahead to do the same thing for the back, and remember the back is not on fold, so this is what we have. So now I'm just going to be joining it, the back to the front, like so, and then I'll sew using 1 inch sewing allowance, which is the allowance that I added while drafting the pattern. So after sewing and you open it up, this is what it should look like. So now the next thing to do now is the remaining part of the skirt pattern that we drafted. I'm going to be dividing it into 3 equal parts. So just make sure that one is almost the same thing with the other. So when you divide it, this is what it should look like. You can divide it by 4 or less, just depends. Just make sure that it is equal. So now you're going to slash it opened like so, and then you can go ahead and label it 1, 2, 3. And now I'm going to be spreading this on the fabric. So right here I have a piece of fabric that is wide enough for what I'm about to do, and the length of the fabric should be more than the length of the pattern paper we want to place on it. Then take note that the fabric is on fold. I place the fabric on fold, so the part that is opened, I'm going to be placing 1 on it like so, and then I'll place 2 and I'll place 3, separating them. So how wide you separate one piece from the next, it just depends on how much gathers you want for the dress. The most important thing here is that you're making sure that you're separating each side equally each piece of pattern equally, and then the hip line is aligned. So you can use a ruler to make sure that the hip line of one pattern is aligning with that of the next. And then also you remember to leave 1 inch sewing allowance at the hemline point. Then when you're done, you're just going to be marking it using half an inch sewing, adding half an inch sewing allowance to the necessary point. So this is what we have now. So you're just going to cut it off like so. So by the time you cut it off, also remember to trace out the hip line and the top of pattern paper 1, and then you notch it at that point. This is very important when you are joining it to the other part of the skirt. And then now I'm just going to be opening it up, and this is what it should look like. So I will be running a gather stitch from one hip line point to the next. You can also go ahead to notch the middle part of the fabric. So now I've run the gather stitch from one hip line to the next. So now what I'm going to be doing is to gather it all the way to the other side. So after gathering it, this is what it should look like. So now to go further, make sure that your gathering should not start from the hip line but on the other points that we marked. I don't know if that makes sense. We know we have 2 notch points, so your gathers will be starting from the second notch, not from the hip line. So now to know how you're going to gather it, you're going to be measuring from one hip line on the other fabric to the next. So what I got is 11 inches or 12 inches thereabout. So now that means I'm going to be gathering it up, making sure that I get back that 12 inches. So now I'm going to be aligning the hip line of the gathered fabric to the hip line of the skirt. And then the center that we notched earlier, you're going to make sure that it's aligning to the side seam of the skirt. And then why we are also make sure that the hip line of the other side of the gathered fabric is aligning to the hip line of the other side of the skirt. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense. Remember, the gathers is not starting at the hip line, it's starting at the second notch point. We notch 2 points while cutting this fabric, so it's the second part. So now when you are done, you're going to sew it using half an inch sewing allowance, and then you also sew all the way down to the hemline, joining it. I'm going to repeat the same process again like I did. So what I'm doing is I'm aligning the hip line of the gathered fabric to the hip line of the skirt, and I also align it all the way down to the hemline. And then also I'll align the hip line of the other side of the gathered fabric to the hip line of the other side of the skirt. And then I'll make sure that the center front of the gathered is aligning to the side seam, and then I will sew it all the way down to the hemline like so, using half an inch sewing allowance. So now back to the bodice. This is what we have. I'm just going to be opening it up like so, and then for the skirt I'm going to be joining it at the waistline. That is, I'm joining the bodice to the skirt at the waistline. So I'm making sure that the side seam is aligning, and then I'll sew it using half an inch sewing allowance. So by the time you're done sewing, this is what it should look like, and we are basically done with this. All we have to do now is we are going to be attaching a zip to this, preferably an invincible zipper, and then we're also going to hem it and then you add your basic sleeve, and that will be all for today's video. If you did enjoy this video, remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Bye.